Hey, Redeemer, this is Pastor Dayton, and a number of weeks ago, I shared with you in a sermon on Matthew 19 that I just simply could not, in the time allotted during Sunday morning services, cover the first part of Matthew 19, which is Jesus' teaching on divorce. And what I told you then was we would issue a recording that we hope will eventually turn into some type of podcast where we would address this issue. So here's what we're going to do right now. I'm just going to simply address this myself through a recording that I hope will supplement our series through the Gospel of Matthew. At some point in the future, when there's a little more bandwidth to do so, our desire would be to begin a podcast series where if something comes up on a Sunday morning that there's just not enough time to chase all of the background, the history, the nuance, the full context of what's being described or discussed in a biblical passage, that we would have an opportunity to record a brief podcast to explore some of those issues more in depth in this format. Nevertheless, for right now, my aim is to provide some broad overview of what the Bible teaches about divorce, particularly based upon what Jesus says here in Matthew 19, and to give you some of the background that takes place in the Old Testament that Jesus is referencing and the Pharisees have in mind when they begin to engage him. And then I'll briefly mention a passage from the Apostle Paul that I think is helpful here as well. So let me give you three ground rules, three biblical convictions that we can have before we engage this passage. Number one, from Genesis 2, we can discern God invented marriage and God oversaw the first marriage between our first parents, Adam and Eve. Number two, that marriage exists, according to Genesis 2, as in part a remedy for loneliness. Adam did not, as he looked at the created order, did not see anything like him. And so God said it was not good for man to be alone. So he created Eve and Adam and Eve, first family. So it certainly has a answer to loneliness. But secondly, it exists in part for the purpose of procreation. And now not every marriage will result in children. And that doesn't make it any less of a marriage. Let me be very clear. But one of the reasons why God instituted marriage, according to the book of Genesis, is for there to be fruitful multiplication that would fill the earth. And the safe place for that to take place is in the context of the family. And then in addition to that, according to Ephesians 5, the primary purpose of marriage is to be a visible declaration to the watching world that the gospel is true, that the husband should be a living illustration of Jesus, loving the church, and the wife should be the living illustration of the church, loving Jesus. And then conviction number 3 would be this, based upon Malachi 2, verses 15 and 16, God hates divorce. God never looks at divorce with joy. Divorce exists in our world because sin is present in the world. Okay, so those are three convictions. God invented marriage, Genesis 2. God created marriage for a specific purpose, the primary purpose being, according to Ephesians 5, the declaration of the gospel. And then number 3, God hates divorce because it undermines the picture of the covenant between God and his people that is supposed to be portrayed in human marriage. So Matthew 19, that's just some of the convictional backdrop we have to have before we look at a passage like this. Pick up in verse 2, large crowds followed him. They followed Jesus, and he healed them there. So he's around the area of the Jordan River. Some Pharisees approached him to test him, and they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any grounds? Now stop there for a second. There is an entire tradition attached to this phrase that is in the historical backdrop. So the Pharisees had developed multiple schools of thought on what does or does not constitute the grounds for divorce in their tradition. And one of the traditions that they had developed, and let me just kind of explain how complex this got. The Pharisaical tradition, there were commentaries on the Old Testament. And then there began to develop commentaries on the commentary. So it's no longer commenting on the Old Testament. It's now one rabbi commenting on the teaching of another rabbi as if the teaching or commentary itself is Scripture. I hope that makes sense, but that's just to kind of paint the picture. Like, well, that sounds really complex. Yes, it was. And that's why the rules, regulations, and laws of the Pharisees became so muddy so quick. So the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds, pulls on a specific Pharisaical tradition where the Pharisees taught that a man could divorce his wife for anything she did that was quote-unquote displeasing. So let me give you the wide, almost ludicrous range of reasons why that could be. So if a man entered the household and thought that his wife did not look attractive, he could divorce her. If she gave birth to a child and he wanted a son and she gave birth to a daughter, he could divorce her. If she talked to him in a way that he did not appreciate her tone, he could divorce her. And so in one of the Pharisaical traditions, the idea was for any reason, if a man just decided he's done, the marriage was over. And so they're essentially asking Jesus to affirm this tradition. And then Jesus says this in verse 4, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that he, God, who created them," that is Adam and Eve, "in the beginning, made them male and female, God's good design, masculinity and femininity, they complement each other." And he also said, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh," referencing Genesis 2. It's what the Apostle Paul highlights as an illustration of the gospel in Ephesians 5. Verse 6, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. They are now one flesh. Therefore, because of that, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And so Jesus is affirming here in verses 4 through 6 that God loves marriage and God hates divorce. That would have made sense of what the Old Testament teaches. But now they think they have Jesus. They think they got him in a trap. Verse 7, they say this, "Why then," they asked him, "did Moses command us to give divorce papers and to send her away?" So in verse 7, they think they've got the perfect trap for Jesus because in Deuteronomy 24, Moses does issue divorce papers, certificates of divorce to Israelites. Verse 8, Jesus responds. He told them, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts, not because what they did constituted biblical grounds for divorce, but because divorce was so rampant." He says, "But it was not like that from the beginning. It's not part of God's good design." Verse 9, "I tell you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." Now, stop for a second. Here's the backdrop of what's taking place. So in verses 8 and 9, Jesus begins to explain that divorce was limited and regulated in certain specific permissible situations to limit the impact on largely the wife. And now, how do I know that? Because in Deuteronomy 24, which is what's being referenced here, talking about the issuing of divorce certificates, the historical backdrop of what was taking place in Israel and throughout the ancient Near East is a man could divorce his wife essentially for any reason, as I just described. And if a woman then, who had very limited options, a largely agrarian society where women were largely regulated to taking care of cattle, animals near the homestead, caring for the children, which was very hard work. It was very laborious work. You know, they would kill and clean animals to cook for meals, etc. They would harvest grain, whatnot. It was very, very hard work. If a woman, that's what she did. That was largely her life. If she was divorced, she only had a very small range of options. And I've referenced this many times on Sunday mornings. Her options were to enter into some form of servanthood or enslavement, whether that is to be a slave in the true sense of being owned by another person, or if that was to enter into an agreement to be a servant for a set period of time. She could prostitute herself to try and survive. She could potentially get returned to her family if they would take her back, or she could try and strike it out on her own in the wilderness and potentially starve to death. So her options were very limited. And what was happening is women that did not have certificates of divorce, they would go seek to get married again. A man would offer to marry them, especially if there's a situation where maybe there were children present. She was in desperate need then for marriage to provide protection and safety from what would take place where children would be carried off into slavery, and just awful things would happen to households where there was not physical protection from brothers, husbands, etc. And so if she sought to get married and a man married her, before the marriage would become final, the first husband could then call on her as his wife, say, no, she needs to come back home. I'm her husband. And then when she returns back home to her first husband, who is probably remarried by this point, he could then throw her out into the street once the new potential husband has now moved on. He kicks her back out. So in short, a malicious man would have the ability to ensure that a woman never remarried, never regained stability, and was put in an incredibly vulnerable position in the ancient world. So God allowed divorce for the purpose of regulating the evil that was present. It was not because divorce is good. The issuing of divorce certificates was meant to minimize the impact upon the innocent and the vulnerable. That's why the divorce certificates were being issued. That's the backdrop. So when they say Moses was offering divorce certificates, was he wrong? And Jesus is rightly saying, no, it's because of the wickedness of your hearts that those were issued to minimize the impact on the innocent. You see principles like this throughout the Old Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, one of the things I've told you many times is what I love about the Bible is the Bible deals with reality as it actually is, not as we would like it to be. So in the Old Testament, you see in different places where God begins to lay the groundwork for an evil to be undone, but in the meantime, he regulates that which is in reality taking place to minimize its impact on the innocent or the vulnerable. You have this with the servant-master relationship in the Old Testament. The majority of human beings on planet Earth were in extreme poverty, and often, if you wanted to marry someone, you would. You even see this with Rachel and Leah and Jacob in the Old Testament, the Book of Genesis. Jacob wants to get married, and so he has to enter into an agreement where he essentially becomes a full-time servant for his would-be father-in-law in order to get married. Things like this were just very common in the ancient Near East. So there was a regulation given. It wasn't, well, you can't do that. The regulation was you need to treat them fairly and kindly, treat them like humans. There were regulations instituted where every so many years someone had to be freed. There were all these different things that were put into place to minimize the impact of a potentially evil action on the innocent and the vulnerable. Now, my goal is not to get into all the ethics of the Old Testament, but simply to say that there is a principle throughout the Old Testament where God issues regulations to minimize the impact on an innocent party, to minimize the impact of evil on an innocent party while dealing with the world as it actually is. So here in Matthew 19, then, Jesus says that divorce is permissible in the instance of sexual sin. He says in verse 9, sexual immorality. That is referencing two passages in particular from your Old Testament. The holiness code from Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, which gives us the wide range of possibilities of sexual sin, from things that are sinful and overtly sinful, but not that shocking, to things that are overtly sinful and overtly shocking. And so you could read those passages on your own later for the wide range of types of sexual sin that Jesus has in mind that he says would allow a form of permissible divorce. So in the instance of adultery and the various sexual sins listed in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, there is permission to divorce. Now, another passage that references divorce is 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7 talks a lot about marriage, talks about singleness. It talks about a wide range of things relationally, but one of the things it mentions is the issue of abandonment. That if somebody essentially walks out, that there is, Paul uses the language that the person who has been abandoned is now free. And he's referencing a phrase that was common on divorce certificates in the Israelite world and the Greco-Roman world, that people are free to marry because they are no longer married. That's what Paul's referencing. Now, the question comes into play based upon what Paul is describing in 1 Corinthians 7, which I just won't take the time to walk through in depth. This abandonment that's described, is that simply just someone leaving and walking out the door, or is there something else in view? Well, the first part of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul describes intimacy in the bounds of marriage. And so a number of scholars would argue that what Paul has in view here is not just simply somebody walking out the door, but abandonment that acts as grounds for divorce would also be constituted by the abandonment of the marital vow. So, what would constitute the abandonment of the marital vow? Let me lay before you an instance that I think would be relatively obvious. An abandonment of the marital vow, I believe, would be an instance of abuse. If you find yourself in an abusive marriage, you need to seek help immediately, whether that is getting to safety, if that is calling on a pastor or pastors to intervene and be involved. But abuse, I believe, without any hesitation, would constitute the abandonment of the marital vow and would follow I believe, the argumentation of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 in a way that would reflect the nature and character of God, to say that this is incompatible with marriage. Additionally, the New Testament, based upon what the New Testament teaches about the Christian life, I would believe that abuse is incompatible with a regenerated heart. In other words, that if you are a follower of Christ, you will not be an abuser. And so these things are incompatible. The Apostle Paul highlights them as incompatibility with growing in Christ-likeness. And even when he gives the qualifications for an elder in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, one of the phrases he uses there could be translated not a striker, that he is not someone who's going to be physically violent. And that is also in the list about managing his household well, husband of one wife, that it is incompatible with Christian maturity and growing in Christ likeness to be abusive. And so that's an instance I think would clearly fit a New Testament biblical ethic of the abandonment of the marital vow. Now, there are those who would highlight some other things, and quite frankly, there are many things that I think you could try to navigate with this, but it would require a significant amount of wisdom and careful consideration in light of the Scriptures. It's why I find a quote like this from R.C. Sproul very helpful, commenting on Matthew 19 and then looking more broadly at what the Bible teaches about marriage and divorce. He said this, quote, "Understanding the principles of marriage and divorce that Jesus laid out here is relatively easy. Applying them to real-life situations often takes the wisdom of Solomon. I do not think that I have seen 2 divorce cases in my ministry that were exactly the same." And so we've got these principles present in the Scripture that certainly in the case of sexual sin that Jesus references, and then what the Apostle Paul references in 1 Corinthians 7 about abandonment, and then applying that as an ethic. There's certainly these instances of permissibility for divorce to minimize the impact on the innocent, which is the Old Testament ethical backdrop. And yet there are many instances where that would need to be navigated carefully. I can think of a variety of instances that have been brought to me over the years, and I would just say this: if you have questions about what's taking place in your marriage, you should bring them forward to a pastor. If you believe that there's abuse taking place in your marriage, you need to make sure, 1, you're safe, and then 2, you need to bring that to a pastor. If you have questions about something that's taking place in the interpersonal aspects of your relationship, and you're just, hey, something just doesn't feel right, bring it forward to a pastor. We would love to help you. We'd love to get you connected with a good biblical counselor if that's what is the right necessary next step. But do not try to navigate it alone if there are difficulty and hardships in your marriage. Even in light of these instances where the Bible would grant permissibility for divorce, given some specific scenarios or principles, Christians should reject the culture of no-fault divorce that has arisen in the West. What I mean by no-fault divorce is the idea that you can simply wake up one day and go, hey, let's just get divorced, and that's just it. It's that simple. That violates, I give you 3 principles at the beginning of this, of what the Bible teaches. 1, that God made marriage. 2, God gave us a marriage to illustrate the gospel. And 3, that God hates divorce. So the culture of no-fault divorce that has arisen in the West is a rejection of those 3 categories, those 3 convictions that arise from Scripture. And so we in the church should reject that too. Not every marriage is going to be sunshine and roses every day, but if things begin to be difficult, you should reach out for help. There is no shame in reaching out to people in your group or reaching out to a pastor saying things are not going well, we need help. You should reach out and get help before things become very, very difficult, or before you decide that you are going to pursue divorce in a no-fault divorce situation. Do not let things get too far down the road before you seek help. And let me just address one of the myths that are spoken about the church. Roughly 50 to 60%, depending on the study you look at, of the American culture, of marriages in American culture into divorce, 50 to 60%, depending on the study. And the argument is that it's the same divorce rate in the church. That's just not true. The data shows that the divorce rate among Christians who are committed to a local gospel preaching church is roughly half of the divorce rate in the broader culture. And the reason why I think that's significant is because Christians would be likely to ask for help in the context of living in community. They'd be likely to reach out to a pastor to ask for help. They'd be more likely to get into a counseling situation to navigate some difficulties in their marriage. And yet divorce still does exist in the context of the church because there are instances of sexual sin. There are instances of abuse among those who claim to be followers of Jesus. There are instances of abandonment where the marriage simply does not survive because of sin or because of even crimes committed against the other person among those that claim to be followers of Jesus. And so the fact that that still remains true among those who profess faith in Jesus is one of the reasons why divorce will continue, unfortunately, in churches, because there is still sin. Now, one of the questions I want to address, because I've been asked over the last few weeks, is what if you were someone who was divorced and you did follow a no-fault divorce culture? It was the idea that you could just wake up one day and decide you wanted to end the marriage. And you did that. So let's assume that that's you and you're listening and you participated in the no-fault divorce culture and now you have remarried. What do? You can't change the past. You need to be faithful where you are. You need to be faithful where you are. I would encourage you to get some biblical counseling to navigate just some of the complexities that come with divorce and remarriage. I don't think that's something you should enter into lightly. I think it's something you should discuss with a counselor to navigate the complexities of your previous marriage, the baggage that would be left over from that's inevitable, and then navigating how that plays itself out in your current marriage. So if that's your story, you're like, hey, you were part of a no-fault divorce in the past. You go, wow, it did not fall under these biblical categories for permissibility. What do I do? Be faithful where you are now. Make sure that you are pursuing health in your marriage now. If you find yourself in a marriage that is experiencing difficulty, I'm going to say it again and again, seek help. Speak to people in your group, reach out to a pastor. We want to help you navigate complexities, difficulties, and sin in your marriage. The way for us to respond to what the Bible teaches about marriage is to prize marriage, value marriage, see marriage for what it is, something God ordained and something that demonstrates the gospel. I hope you found this helpful. We intend to do this again in the coming months, and so stay tuned for more podcast recordings in the future.